What is up guys, it is Ross, here with yet another Ross Rambles essay about Mario Kart Wii Limitless. My ramblings have become pretty infrequent, and for that I do apologise, as many people in the community seem to dig them. But don't worry, they're coming back. In a brand new form no less, a video series where I document various aspects of the mod, their historical relevance, and the changes they've had over the years. A series that I will call The Legend of Mario Kart Wii Limitless. Limitless has actually been around for quite a while, entering development all the way back in August of 2022, though our community has largely been grassroots and has only recently become sizable once TWD98 himself gave the mod a glance in one of his videos. A surprisingly undercover timeline, which in my opinion makes a fantastic starting point to this series, as we've just released version 4.1 of Limitless as of the time of writing this essay, and the previous versions have had plenty of history to them as well. Well, strap in everyone, as we delve into episode 1 of The Legend of Mario Kart Wii Limitless, the mod timeline. But before we start, a little disclaimer. Mario Kart Wii Limitless is a mod that aims to balance Mario Kart Wii for both casual and competitive players alike, with many quality of life changes appeasing to both ends of the spectrum. Each vehicle has a unique playstyle, each character has their own distinct niche, tracks were given adjustments to make them more fair and fun, and so on and so forth. If you would like to hear more about the mod, the community, or simply want to play it for yourself, I implore you to check out the official Mario Kart Wii Limitless Discord server. The link will be in the video description. We promise you it'll be a blast to be in. Now, back to the video. Since I will be covering the entire timeline, my points on each of the key time spans will be very brief summaries and not hyper-analyzations. For those who are curious on the nitty-gritty details, I will likely give each of the major periods a Ross Rambles of their own in the future. The story begins, not with Limitless funny enough, but a bigger and more well-known Mario Kart Wii balancing mod, succinctly titled Rebalanced by YouTuber and streamer ArcIntel. For players who noticed that some vehicles in Limitless function vaguely similar to those in Rebalanced, it's because Rebalanced laid the groundwork for Limitless to build off of. Effectively, Arc's mod was an inspiration for ours. The reason why this is important is because Limitless's changes happened in increments, and anything that went unchanged for that period of time functioned identically to how they did in Rebalanced, by virtue of Rebalanced being the basis for early Limitless. This conveniently meant that the Limitless community was moderately involved from the get-go. Just about every early Limitless player was a Rebalanced player who made the switch, and even today there are still a solid majority of players who hailed from this Rebalanced Limitless transition. So, what stuff did Limitless change? The vehicles. Yup, in the beginning only the vehicles received any direct changes. Characters and item probabilities were uncharted territory, the track list hadn't been yet decided, and owing to Rebalanced's own use of codes, changing them wasn't a particularly high priority. I'm sorry, did I say the vehicles? Whoops, my bad, I should have clarified that only some of the vehicles were changed in the pre-alpha stage. After initial experimentation with various common.sds files released to the public with test concepts, patches which I will dub the pre-alpha storm for simplicity, playstyles and balance tweaks for vehicles were settled on and released in order of weight class. Lightweights came first, with the lightweight build releasing on August 18th, 2022, while the medium weight build would come out 4 days later. It should be noted that unchanged vehicles functioned identically to how they did in Rebalanced, so during the brief time frame these builds were considered current, they were soft banned for players for the purpose of testing out balance. As a result of this, the quote-unquote metagame for these builds of the mod were way more restrictive. Notice how I haven't mentioned heavyweights at all. This is because their official release marked the end of pre-alpha, so they were effectively forced to sit this era out. Sorry Flame Runner players, your time will come. Maybe. One final thing to note about the metagame of pre-alpha is that it was restricted to friend rooms only. As a caveat of using Rebalanced's framework, Limitless didn't yet have its own region for matchmaking. What this meant was that if you tried to enter a worldwide, it would matchmake you with players playing on Rebalanced, and since Limitless players would be using a common.sds file with modified stats, they would get temporarily banned. Fortunately, friend rooms do not have this anti-cheat restriction, which made online testing viable using this method, although it was somewhat inconvenient to have to set up a room just to play online. This was a thing that was fixed in version 1, so the region issue affected not only pre-alpha, but alpha as well. The official rebalancing of heavyweight vehicles marked the shift into Limitless Alpha, during which 9 patches were released, 8 major and 1 hotfix. No other period of the mod's history comes close to this density of activity, as new patches were a weekly occurrence at one point in time. As a direct result of this, the alpha metagame was synonymous with volatility and chaos, with what seemed to be the quote-unquote meta vehicle changing radically every couple of weeks as new changelogs rolled out. Beyond specific vehicle retunes, 2 big balancing shakeups happened during the alpha stage. The first was a universal weight standardization which occurred in alpha version 2.1, which sought to address complaints regarding the impact getting bumped has in Mario Kart Wii's engine. This would be a passive buff to lightweights and a passive nerfs to heavyweights, of course. The second, and arguably more defining of the two big shakeups, was a universal acceleration buff that happened in Alpha 2.3, made in an attempt to make mistakes less punishing for casual players. Beyond the vehicles, the Alpha version 2.0 patch of Limitless, which confusingly was the fourth official Alpha build, also saw the inaugural track list, a list of custom tracks that would replace the more controversial base game tracks for each version, and would be updated with each version as opinions on existing tracks soured and the hottest new custom tracks were taken into consideration. Character stats were also first experimented with here, and would see further tweaks in Alpha version 2.1 and Alpha version 2.3. As hinted at before, the metagame of Limitless Alpha was tumultuous and chaotic thanks to the constant bombardment of balancing updates, but the polarizing stat spreads of vehicles at the time deserve a mention too. Believe it or not, there was once a time where off-road vehicles were the most despised vehicles in the mod, as their off-road stats were so much higher than they were now that they became incredibly track dependent, with the remainder of their stat spreads making or breaking each individual vehicle. The Super Blooper and the Dolphin Dasher were the two vehicles that encapsulated everything there was to hate about off-road vehicles, since they had the versatility to extend beyond their niche, while simultaneously having just enough speed and mini-turbo to wield their off-roading capabilities to infuriating effect. This problem was exacerbated tenfold with the track list, where tracks like GBA Sunset Wilds and SNES Donut Plains 3 existed. Corsas were also arguably at an all-time high here as well, with Jet Setter and Honeycoop considered by many to be straight up broken in the earlier alpha builds, and Sprinter being an omnipresent force in competitive circles. These vehicles were simply considered way too fast compared to other vehicles at the time, in some patches even being able to severely outspeed the mini-turbo bikes while in a mini-turbo. The initially large gap between high tiers and low tiers also allowed these sport vehicles to thrive thanks to their high ceilings far outweighing their inconsistency, with Bullet Bike and Flameflyer being particularly offenders. Other vehicles like Sneakster, Booster Seat, Jet Bubble, Blue Falcon, Classic Dragster and the Standard Carts came and went as the patches passed, indicative of the ever-shifting competitive climate brought about by the major balancing shakeups being brought about on a near-weekly basis. The Blue Falcon deserves a special footnote that is relevant because of a metagame shift brought about towards the midway point of the final alpha patch, version 2.4. It was discovered that tap turning was an incredibly effective way of cancelling out the Blue Falcon's performance transmission drawback, while also giving it a passive buff to its otherwise shaky manoeuvrability. With the Blue Falcon suddenly becoming a pseudo-Corsa without the drawbacks Corsa vehicles typically had, the Blue Falcon wound up dominating the final few weeks of competitive alpha, becoming the defining vehicle of the period in the eyes of many players. Alpha also saw the kickstarting of Limitless's official tournament circuit, retroactively named Season 0 once the mod went public. Unlike the more streamlined and standardized Mogi format that most Mario Kart Wii related competitive circles use, Limitless tourneys use a knockout format, and in Season 0 specifically they had a double elimination bracket system not unlike the one used in high-level esports like Super Smash Bros. This segregation of players gave way to smaller room sizes and gave players more room to stretch their driving wheels, causing the more consistent performers to rise to the top. Kane the Snowman, a prominent kart lounge figurehead and widely regarded as one of the best vanilla karters in the world, was the undisputed king of Mario Kart Wii Limitless Season 0, winning 5 out of the 6 tournaments he attended, and while there was a multi-man melee for second fiddle throughout the majority of the season, in the end Fern emerged as the true runner-up owing to his consistency that was unrivaled at his level of skill. Upon the final release of Alpha version 2.4, a series of beta patches were released, testing out the fledgling changes Limitless was making to stand on its own 2 feet, independent of Rebalanced. This included the transition to a brand new file system, new codes, some vehicles getting entirely reworked, and reverting the base game tracks to their base game selves, in contrast to Rebalanced where just about every track received some form of alteration. These patches would be released concurrently as the version 2.4 patch continued to be played, and as Limitless Season 0 drew on. The most acclaimed change by far was the addition of a worldwide region, something that players had been craving ever since the mod's inception, as it allowed for much better accessibility and made things much easier to playtest. After a full week of 2023 celebrations, it finally happened. Mario Kart Wii Limitless was officially released to the public. No longer was the community hidden underground in Arc Intel's basement. Now anybody could join it publicly, provided the word spread of course. In stark contrast to pre-alpha and alpha, version 1 consisted of a single patch, that being well, V1. In fact, to this day, this marks the longest span of time that Limitless has went without any changes of any kind, with version 1.0 being the official version of the mod for a whopping 155 days, just over 5 months. Characters went untouched from alpha version 2.3, but that was largely overlooked by the new big change version 1 brought to the table. Item probability differences. No longer would a sucker stuck in 8th place be saddled with a single shell to do nary an impact on the invincible stars and bullet bills the competitors in their immediate vicinity would be spamming. These probabilities were not perfect right out of the gate. Triple green shells, bob-ombs and mega mushrooms were incredibly abundant in the upper mid spots, and the infamous blue shell was a frequent ruiner of races, but it was a start. Codes were also added, although admittedly it was mostly the same quality of life changes that were present in Rebalanced as well. Finishing times on results, brake drifting, fast falling, Mii's having their intended stat bonuses, license unlock, and many more. Lastly, the tracks. The settled on tracklist for V1 contained the following custom tracks: Kamek's Library, Frantic Funyard, Midnight Museum, Northern Heights, GCN Yoshi Circuit, GBA Cheeseland, 3DS Music Park, N64 Wario Stadium, DS TikTok Clock, DS Mario Circuit, and GCN Dino Dino Jungle. Keep these tracks in the back of your head. It should be noted that V1 was considered at the time to be roughly on par with Alpha in terms of competitive balance, so the metagame was, for the most part, figured out fairly quickly. However, as mentioned, V1 consisted of a single balance patch, so there was very little room for big meta shakeups, with the few that did occur here and there stemming purely from players experimenting with alternative options. In any case, this all led to the V1 metagame becoming very centralized, with specialist vehicles rising to the top and generalists falling behind. This is because the perceived larger gap in viability between top tiers and low tiers made the safer jack-of-all-trades vehicles less appealing, as their consistency would be far outweighed by their lower potential compared to other vehicles. Also, remember when I told you to keep the tracklist in mind? Yeah, well that's because V1's meta was also incredibly track pick heavy, since a lot of V1's tracklist greatly favoured a particular archetype of vehicle. GBA Cheeseland, due to its overabundance of weak off-road, was pretty much an auto-win for off-road vehicles. GCN Yoshi Circuit and DS Mario Circuit were generally excellent for mini-turbo vehicles for their tight turns, and Frantic Funyard and DS TikTok Clock were very favourable for courses due to their long straightaways. If you were using any one of those vehicle archetypes, what tracks you wanted to pick would quickly become apparent and would scarcely change. Speaking of those vehicle archetypes, it is of no surprise that they ruled the roost in V1, due to the combination of what had just been covered regarding both the centralization of the metagame and the selection of tracks there were for players to abuse. The Quacker was, without question, the vehicle to beat in this patch. Its low speed was somewhat circumvented by a series of universal nerfs from Alpha making every vehicle slower relative to it, and with Quacker having the lowest base speed, it ended up gaining the most from this exchange, doubly so due to its ultra-long mini-turbo duration of 200 frames, ensuring that it would be cruising through almost every single straightaway in the game at top speed. Pretty much its only statistical flaw lay in its weight stat, but one could patch that up significantly depending on their character choice, due to the way character weight bonuses were calculated in V1. The Quacker was so strong in fact that the rest of the metagame was significantly warped in its presence. How good other vehicles ended up being was dependent on how well they stacked up against Quacker, and the other mini-turbo vehicles fell significantly out of favour purely due to the Quacker's strength and ease of use effectively keeping them out of a job. Honeycoop remained a solid choice from the alpha days, and eventually rose to become the unanimous number 2 vehicle in V1, with its high raw speed and consistency making it a powerful check to Quacker on several tracks, although the Honeycoop was also a controversial vehicle in its own right, as it indirectly enforced the track wars that took place throughout V1's metagame. Jet Setter was similar. It had a higher ceiling than Honeycoop by virtue of its higher max speed, but its bouncier physics and worse acceleration made it less consistent. In the early days of V1 it was actually in contention for best vehicle in the game, but once it was discovered just how centralizing Quacker was, it dropped off a little, and Honeycoop's consistency gradually became preferred. Super Blooper rounded out V1's top tier, as its hybrid of mini-turbo and off-road gave it a strong niche as the best off-road vehicle in a patch where they remained controversial, while simultaneously allowing it to genuinely coexist with Quacker as a mini-turbo based vehicle. What it lacked in raw strength, it more than made up for with its versatility, as its stat spread was incredibly varied. Finally, while they weren't considered top tier, special mention must go to the 5th and 6th best vehicles in the mod, Shooting Star and Blue Falcon. The former was a heavyweight Quacker with a higher ceiling on certain tracks, but was nowhere near as consistent and ultimately didn't see much use. In any case, it held the title of V1's champion outside drift bike. The latter was an example of a vehicle that did very well for itself while not being a Corsa, mini-turbo vehicle, or off-road vehicle, which is worthy of note as this was incredibly anti-meta for V1 standards. The automatic mode exploit was nerfed to no longer be effective, but beyond that, the vehicle itself remained largely intact. The competitive format for Season 1 would see something of a rework. Events were now single elimination as opposed to double elimination. This meant that players would no longer be separated from each other as the tournaments led on, which prevented smaller rooms from occurring until the finals. Rest in peace, Bullet Bike. This lack of segregation meant that there were generally much more room for upsets via top-level players getting eliminated earlier than expected. Bigger rooms are inherently more chaotic than smaller rooms, what with power items being more prevalent and all, which meant that the luck element was significantly increased from the earlier tournament bracket system. Kane the Snowman continued to showcase his dominance early on, but due to only attending a single tournament throughout Season 1, he was unable to defend his crown. This paved the way for Fern to succeed, with him picking up where he left off in Season 0 and became the most consistent player in the game, entering the finals in every single event he attended. Ryumi also became a finalist mainstay from the 5th event onwards, following the switch to Quacker from his trademark Flame Runner, a vehicle which just could not hack it in V1's climate, and went on to become the season's runner-up. Once the competitive season drew to a close, there was another round of beta testing that commenced, with 3 official V2 betas being produced. Unlike the V1 betas, the V2 betas were largely building off of the previous version as opposed to making radical changes beyond balancing decisions and tracklist changes. It should be noted that V2's beta testing phase was shorter than V1's, lasting just over a month. As you can probably surmise by the sheer length of this video, Limitless indeed has a surprising amount of history. So much so that I am going to be splitting the video up into 2 parts, the first of which is coming to an end. Don't worry, we'll be picking up where we left off soon enough. With that being said, I would like to thank everybody who watched/listened to this installment of Ross Rambles. Normally I do these essays in a Word document, but after recently investing in an Elgato HD60X, I decided to try my hand at a video format. With that being said, thank you so much for watching, and this is Ross signing off. Goodbye.